Greetings, it's Allie, and if you're watching this video, I hope you're here to learn some insights about the Hierophant, because that's what I'm going to talk about today. I made this video to share some of my thoughts on this particular card, just things that I've learned through my personal studies, experience, and observations. If you're familiar with my channel, you know that I'm a fan of pop culture decks. I even call my tarot practice Geek and Faerie because I believe strongly that stories are the keepers of universal wisdom and the collective unconscious, all stories from fairy tales to comic books. And they house the wisdom of the human experience and guide us and advise us as we travel along our own paths. Another motivation for this video was that I started a personal project whereby I wanted to, just for my own curiosity, compare the archetypes and the cards in the tarot to those characters that we know and love in our favorite stories and see what kind of insight I could extract. I think that there is a lot of similarities, and it really shows in these pop culture decks. I know people have strong opinions sometimes on pop culture decks. Some people find them a little too commercial or gimmicky, and they feel like that takes away from the spirituality of it. And I totally get that, and I think that's completely valid. However, I hope maybe hearing the other side of the argument, maybe I can convince you that there is a lot of value in these pop culture decks because of the storytelling element, because of the character, the strength of the characters, their personalities, the duality between villains and heroes, and how that influences us in our own lives and how it shapes our own personalities and our own life choices. So here I'm going to share with you some of my cards, some of my observations, in the hopes that you might learn something. I say that with intending that you kind of take what resonates with you and forget the rest. I'm not the living expert on tarot. I'm just here to share my insights, my observations. And I also invite you to share any observations and thoughts you have in the comments in hopes that maybe you can teach me, because there's probably things that I have overlooked or missed or just weren't on my radar. So please feel free to leave a comment. So I'm going to start just by having the traditional kind of Rider-Waite-Smith. This is from the Universal Waite Tarot. This is the Hierophant. The figure in the center is the Pope. Here we have the cross keys, which is an important symbol that represents the relationship between heaven and earth. The Pope is kind of the gatekeeper, the spokesman for heaven here on earth. So there's a relationship there. We see him dressed in a lot of finery, with his three-tiered crown, the scepter. His robes represent riches. This is the ruling card for the sun sign Taurus, and I don't know if you can make it out there, but you can see on his throne or chair there is the symbol of Taurus in the corners of the throne. And Taurus is an earth sign who tends to love material things, and I don't mean that in a sort of judgy way. But I know a lot of my Taurus friends are collectors. They love to have they just love their things. They love to collect things. It gives them a sense of purpose. Here we have two figures that symbolize some people of maybe less important, the followers. Here we have the leader in the center, the one that is teaching, the one that is speaking to the leader. These are the followers, a little more humble, a little more modest in their dress. The bald heads are an embodiment of modesty and humility. And the sign that he's making here with his hands, two fingers pointed to heaven and two to earth, which is also, you can see there's a connection there with the magician who has one hand pointed to heaven and one to earth. And I'm going to go back to that later on because I feel like that's also important to compare the Hierophant to the previous 5 cards that come before it. So what does this card represent when we put all this together? Well, we have a male persona who's richly dressed, who has influence, power, charisma. He's a teacher who has a vision for the world. That is key. I'm going to show you that when I reveal some of these other cards here. That was the aha moment that I got when I pulled out all of my pop culture cards, all the Hierophants from all my pop culture decks, and that was a pattern that popped out right away. Was a teacher who has a vision for the world, who recruits followers who want to support their cause. Another traditional theme with the Hierophant is that he represents ritual and tradition, spirituality, obviously. We also see an education. Here he is preaching or teaching to his followers. There's also the traditional meaning of the Hierophant symbolizing a group of people or a space where like-minded individuals can come and gather. A place that is sort of it can represent not just a person, but a group of people, a tribe, a sense of belonging, a place of a higher purpose, a place where you don't feel left out, where you feel included and have that sense of belonging. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take this guy away, and I'm going to flip over these pop culture decks, and I'll tell you which decks they are if it wasn't obvious already. So these three I felt were the most important. These were the three that gave me the kind of aha things that I noticed about the Hierophant that I hadn't noticed just looking at the traditional card. So here is Dumbledore from the Harry Potter Tarot deck, a perfect Hierophant. Here we have Ghul from the DC Justice League Tarot, and over here is Lord Varys from the Game of Thrones Tarot. And right away, what I noticed, what these three characters all have in common is a connection to an institution. They are all leaders in their own right, or they hold a place of power. I found it interesting here that we have a villain instead of a hero as the Hierophant, which brings in a really interesting dynamic, but there is commonalities between all three characters. All three characters are leaders that have some influence and power. They all embrace tradition or make use of tradition, but they also recognize a need for change or reform, which is really important. That balance between tradition, ritual, and change and reform. They have a set of rules, they have structure, but what they all have in common is a vision for the world. They all see that the world should be or ought to stay a certain way. I feel like the Pope does the same in his role in the world. And although they aren't necessarily kings or presidents or world leaders, they are leaders of their own institution. Maybe, Varys is a bit, not quite the leader, but he stands beside the leader. He certainly he whispers in the ear of, he has some degree of influence. He has no desire to be in power himself, but he certainly has influence, and I feel like Dumbledore does the same. Has no interest in politics, however, has a vision for how he thinks the world should be, and uses the power he does have in order to influence those in politics to make the changes that he feels are necessary. And Ghul, the leader of the League of Shadows, or League of Assassins, he has a vision for the world. He has, steeped in tradition and mysticism himself, well trained in, he is kind of a magician or a sorcerer, but he feels like he feels that the world, for the most part, is corrupt, and he wants to see order and justice restored. He just has a funny way of going about it, which is why he clashes with Batman or Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne doesn't see that the ends justify the means, whereas Ghul does. Ghul decides that in order to save humanity, he must first destroy the bulk of it. He is long-lived. He's been around a long time, which is another theme I noticed in a lot of Hierophant cards that I have. They have a lot of wisdom. They've lived a long time. They've seen a lot of things. They have a lot of stories to tell. They have a lot of wisdom to impart. His judgment of the world as it is right now is that it is corrupt, that it needs reform, that it needs change, that he wants to restore order and justice in the world, just like Bruce Wayne does, just like Batman does. However, they have very different opinions about how to go about that, and that is what separates them, one the hero and one the villain. It makes them enemies because they don't see eye to eye on how to achieve that goal, but that is the goal. So they have a vision for the world. So here he is holding the world. He wants to see change. He wants to see reform. Varys as well. He's a little more sneaky about it. He has to be for his own survival. He plays his role very well. He has this vision. He wants to see a monarch that is going to be good for the people. He knows he has to tolerate maybe a few bad ones in the meantime to get there, and he humors them while he goes kind of behind closed doors and makes things happen in the background. I feel like Ra's al Ghul was doing the same, as was Dumbledore. Dumbledore was definitely using his power to make change in the wizarding world. He knew that there was something bad coming, and he was doing all he could to make the Ministry of Magic see his point of view and make change. But as we know from the stories, the Ministry of Magic was in denial that Voldemort was there. They didn't want to work with it because they didn't want to believe it. Some of the officials in the ministry were corrupt themselves. They were working for Voldemort. So again, trying to keep, there was definitely a war happening, and Dumbledore having a lot of influence and power, respect in his community. He was very cryptic too in his advice, especially with Harry and Ron and Hermione. They'd go to him with their reports, with their thoughts, and he would never give them specific directions. He was always very cryptic in his wisdom, so that he allowed his students the chance to figure things out on their own. And I love Varys here too. I love the little birds. I just love that touch. His little birds, his little informants that he had on the streets, keeping him informed, keeping kind of that power of gossip, which is really powerful. People criticize gossip quite a bit. And it does definitely, I'm not denying that it does have a lot of negativity associated with it, but gossip is also really important to culture and staying connected with others and staying informed, and also gauging where you are and what your role is in society or in your community, knowing what is approved of, what is disapproved of, and stories do the same thing. Here we have a very similar goal to restore order and justice, but a slight difference between villain and hero is what you do with your power, and the choices you make determine whether you're going to be a hero or a villain. And Dumbledore says that as well. At one point in the story, he says it's not our abilities that define us, but our choices. A big part of the Hierophant is that you have a male person with influence and power and charisma who has a vision for the world and uses his power. Another character that, if they ever did a Marvel deck, I would think that the perfect character for that would be Professor Xavier. Charles Xavier has a vision for the world. He's the leader of an institution. He brings people together who feel like they're outcasts. So they're people who feel like they don't belong in society, and he gives them a place where they belong. So another theme with the Hierophant is creating that space, creating that place where people feel safe, where people can feel like they're not weird, and connect with people just like them. Here. Now, this card here is a little bit different. This is from the Shadowhunters Tarot. And I had a hard time. I really had to sit and think about how is Brother Zachariah. He's not really like the rest. He's not a leader per se. He does have a connection to the Silent Brotherhood, which was, very much represented like a monastery. It was very monastery-like in the Shadowhunter universe. They were like monks, they were medics, they were scribes, they were keepers of knowledge. They had a very kind of sacred access to knowledge that your average shadow hunter didn't have. Shadow hunters would go to them for special cases to learn very specialized runes or spells or magic or healing powers that only the Silent Brothers were capable of knowing and performing. And here he is holding the soul sword, which was a sacred object in the Shadowhunter culture. They used it for their trials, where anyone who was being interrogated had to hold the soul sword so that they could only speak the truth. And it was primarily used for that purpose rather than, a weapon in battle. So how does Brother Zachariah represent the Hierophant, other than his connection to that kind of religious institution? Even though it's not really a religious institution, the characters do act and behave a lot like monks. He is a special case because I think it comes down to, again, the keeper of knowledge and wisdom and storytelling. He's been around a long time. He has, unlike other shadow hunters, because of his service in the Brotherhood, he was able to essentially be immortal. He saw many generations come and go. He watched his friends age and die while he lived on, and he saw the next generation. The Herondales were a big name, usually the main characters in all of the books, and he watched them grow and live and die, and the next generation be born, and he has a lot of wisdom that he can pass on to each next generation. And so I think that is another one of his connections, and that's what's really important when using the Shadowhunter tarot deck. Let's go back to Varys. Now, another character from Game of Thrones, which I think may have possibly, and probably a lot of people agree with me. I know a lot of people were disappointed with the lack of characters in this deck, that a lot of people, I hope I'm not alone, would have expected to see the High Sparrow as the Hierophant, another character in the story who had a connection to religion. He used his spirituality and his sense of morality to make choices that made a change in the world. They weren't necessarily selfish, except for the fact that maybe they were his morals and his spirituality that he was trying to impose upon others. However, he did live modestly and in poverty. He had no desire to rule the world, to be king, but he certainly is the leader of the sect known as the Sparrows, and had a vision for the world where he believed that it didn't matter what rank you were in society, whether you were highborn or living in the streets. It didn't matter. The rules applied equally to everyone, and he certainly enforced that very militantly. So this prompted me, all this kind of insight that I got from these characters as related to the Hierophant, brought me back to this guy. Now, this isn't from a tarot deck. This is from an oracle. This is the Faerie's oracle, and this card is the Sage. But this Sage has always reminded me a little bit of the Hierophant. Then the Sage represents, an older male character, a masculine archetype, who has a lot of wisdom, so has been around a long time, has a certain degree of influence, who listens to others, who engages with others in order to learn. So there's a learning aspect. There is this balance between teacher and student. So the Sage believes that he will never stop learning. I love how there's sort of this connection with Odin, and that searching for wisdom. Odin gave up one of his eyes for the sake of knowledge, wisdom, and learning. And so I always kind of see that when I see sort of that connection with wisdom and knowledge and learning and education and that one eye. I feel like that's what that represents. That's that connection with Odin. Now, the other thing with the Sage that I love is that it's good to have rules, it's good to have structure, it's good to embrace tradition and promote tradition and pass on tradition and teach tradition, but also recognize when there's a need for change and reform. And Obviously, Dumbledore has his traditions. Hogwarts is a very old school, has taught many generations of wizards, and yet Dumbledore can see when things have gotten too stale and things need to change. Same with Ghul. He's been around a long time. He uses ritual, he uses magic, so there's definitely tradition in his practice. However, he sees a vision of change. And same with Varys, who keeps tradition. He doesn't want to change the social structure or the government, the structure of the government, but he wants to see someone deserving sit on the throne instead of who is there. So he has he has a vision for how the world should be as well. So what I also see with all of this, Ra's al Ghul was trying to convince Bruce Wayne to become his heir, to become the Dark Knight. He even trained and mentored Bruce in different stories like Batman Begins and in the Gotham TV series, and I imagine in the comic books. I'm not as familiar in the comics as I'd like to be, but I certainly really immerse myself and love the movies and TV. I love Batman, the whole Batman mythos. So we can see that the Hierophant is a person who wants to take action in the world. So not a passive person, but someone who takes action, often in secret, to maintain their anonymity. They have no ambitions to further their own power. They always are working towards a cause or a greater good. So this differs from the Magician card, another card that symbolizes taking action. And so here again, we have the two fingers to heaven, two to earth, a hand to heaven, and a hand pointing to earth. There is both of these cards, the similarity is that they both require taking action in the world. However, I feel like the difference between them is that the Hierophant will take action for a greater good, for a group of individuals, for humanity, for an institution, for a vision. They have a cause of how they want the world to be like, and they want to see change in the world. The Magician takes action for his own personal gain, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's selfish. I mean, we do have to look out for ourselves every now and then, and that's what that's the difference. Both these cards require taking action. That's their masculine side coming out to play, where one is for personal gain, the other is for a greater good. So again, I saw a similarity between the Hierophant, who is a leader, and the Emperor, who is also a leader. But I feel like the difference between these two characters is that the Emperor is a leader. The Emperor has power. The Emperor is looked to for decision making. The Emperor is the face of power. The Hierophant is a little more behind the scenes. Where the Emperor would be king, the Hierophant would be the kingmaker. And we see that actually in all these characters here, where Varys is playing the kingmaker. Ra's al Ghul is in his own way playing the kingmaker. He sees a vision for Bruce Wayne. He wants to see Bruce become the Dark Knight. He wants to see Bruce become the heir. He's trying to make that happen. Dumbledore wants to see certain people in power over others, and certainly uses his influence to do so. The Fool. So if we keep going through all the previous cards in the major arcana that lead up to the Hierophant, the Fool, I feel like he is the hero that would encounter or become the Hierophant. So the Fool has to decide if he is going to be the leader who has a cause, a vision for humanity, or is he going to be the follower? Is he going to join a circle of people, a tribe, a group, a church, a school, a club, a new community. So is he the follower, or is he going to step up and become that leader that takes care of that group or tribe or community? So not for selfish means, but for the greater good. So while the Hierophant also has this spiritual element, we talked about how he represents spirituality and community and, religious institution and ritual and tradition. We can say the same. A lot of that also applies to the High Priestess. So how are they different? Well, the Hierophant represents the exoteric. So the traditions that are out in the open, that are there for everybody to see so that people can come and participate and be recruited. It's the traditions we tend not to question because they're so familiar to us, whereas the High Priestess represents a more esoteric tradition, more secret mysticism, more secret society, more internal, versus the big show, the big extravagant. He's got the robes, he's got the power, he's got the tools, the magic wands, the scepters, the crowns, all the ritual tools, the knives, cauldrons, what have you. We see all that. The High Priestess is a little more secretive, it's a little more closed. Let's say the doors are a little more closed, a little more exclusive. Or it's the individual spiritual beliefs, the stuff that goes on internally versus what you see in the collective. So that's the difference between those two. Though they both have this spiritual nature to them, there is a difference, which is the esoteric and the exoteric, the secret and the out in the open, or the internal versus what is visible to everyone. Now, those ones were easy. I felt like comparing those 4 cards to the Hierophant were pretty easy. They seemed pretty obvious, the similarities and the differences. But I thought I couldn't not talk about the Empress. How does the Empress compare to the Hierophant? And I feel like there's virtually no similarities. These are pretty much completely on opposite. I couldn't really find a similarity. In fact, there was just much more duality to them and opposite than anything else. So here we have the masculine and the feminine, different ends of the spectrum. We also have nature versus institution, humanity, civilization. That's a big difference between these two as well. We also have rules and structure versus more free-thinking creativity. So yeah, these 2 cards are very much the opposite of each other, more so than any of the other 4 cards that I compared to the Hierophant, that come before the Hierophant, at least anyway. So to recap some of these pop culture characters who symbolize the Hierophant in various decks. They are a masculine character who has a vision for the world, who is taking action in the world to achieve that vision, who often does it in secret, but not always, who wants change for humanity, who gets people to come on board to realize their vision. They encourage unity rather than individuality, and they sometimes go to the extreme where they will kill anyone who opposes them. They can be very dogmatic about their beliefs and about their vision. And I just wanted to share a couple more cards from 2 other decks, not pop culture decks per se. This is the Hierophant from the Legend Arthurian Tarot, and here we have the character Taliesin. Now, the story I'm familiar with Taliesin is the one with Caradwyn and her cauldron, which is an interesting story, but it's not really relevant to the Hierophant in this way. But in this card, we see him grown up. He was a child in the Caradwyn story. But here he is, he's a bard, and he's showing the children his harp. So here he is sharing his knowledge, sharing his wisdom. He's inspiring others. He's also a storyteller. Bards were the storytellers and the carriers of news. I want to say gossip, but they were a little more eloquent, a little more poetic than that. But again, with the theme, back to the whole kingmaker theory, that they weren't the king, but the kingmaker. Well, when bards were prominent, they had the ability to immortalize kings, to make them heroes or make them villains. They spread the word, and they recruited people, if they were entertaining enough, or people agreed with their story or found their story interesting or amusing or entertaining. That had power, that had the ability to make or break a king. So I found that really interesting. And here, this is one of my favorite decks. This is the Heirophant from the Shadowscapes Tarot. And I feel like this guy, again, is very much like Brother Zachariah in that he's this tree character. So to me, the tree is someone who's been around a long time, who's seen a lot of things. He's telling a story to these little lizards here that are climbing up his branches, and he's telling them stories, and he's imparting his wisdom, and he's teaching them, and he's passing on his knowledge and his wisdom. She's sharing the stories, the things that he's seen over all his time. And I feel like trees are very, here, he has his roots, which I feel like symbolize the tradition, that, he's not very movable, not very flexible, perhaps. So those are my thoughts and observations on the Hierophant, and I would love to know what you think. If you had anything that was interesting or inspiring to you, something that you took away, please let me know in the comments. If you notice things that I didn't notice, if you have more insight to any of these characters, maybe you know them a little better than I do, or had a stroke of insight that kind of made you had an aha moment yourself, some patterns that you saw with these cards that I've shown you, or maybe some of the cards from your own deck things I didn't mention, please add those to the comments, because there are probably others who either agree with you or would love to know what you have to say. So thank you so much for watching. I intend to do more of these for different cards in the deck. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and until next time, stay shiny and keep sparkling.